part of the problem lies in the desire in modernism, as in the desire in Marxism, to have a breach with the past.
Yes.
That is the problem. To deliberately put up a barrier to tradition is a form of destruction. And at the heart of the modernist project, you could say, just as at the heart of the Marxist project, there is a desire to destroy the past.
My name is David Clayton. I'm the Provost of Pontifex University, a Catholic online university. I'm also the Artist in Residence of the Scala Foundation. I'm here with Sir James MacMillan, who is a composer and a conductor, and we're here in the studio and on the campus of Princeton Theological Seminary. There is an event occurring, there's a series of workshops and classes for the formation of composers and conductors and choristers with a focus on sacred music. It's organised by the Catholic Sacred Music Project, and one of the patrons is the Scala Foundation. And so I'm delighted that you're here today, James. Thank you for coming along.
Mm-hmm. Delighted to be back. This is my second time working with the Catholic Sacred Music Project.
Yes, it's going to be a wonderful week, and of course there's a concert and a discussion at the end of the week which will showcase the wonderful work that you're doing. I'm looking forward to that very much. So I'm interested as an artist. I love music, and I've even performed some of your music. I've sung it in the choir that I sing in church. But I always come at it when I think about music from my position as being a painter, an artist, and I'm always drawing at connections and analogies. So when I became an artist, or when I decided I wanted to become an artist, one of the things that struck me about Christian art was that it isn't just what you paint. So you can have a subject that is consistent with a Christian worldview. It might be Christ on the cross, it might be a landscape that brings out the glory of God's creation. But it isn't just the choice of the subject, it's how you paint it. There is an underlying form or structure or style in painting that either undermines or conversely works with and harmonizes with the subject that you're trying to present. Now, I'm interested whether you feel that that's true in music as well. I think of Gregorian modes and Byzantine tones, for example, as being the typical keys for sacred music. But how do you engage with those with sacred music? And do you think about the form as well as the content in terms of the words you're putting the music to?
Well, certainly the words are important if words are to be set. In many ways, the composer has to serve the text, especially in liturgy. The text has to be communicated to the praying community, and so in many ways the composer has to serve that. There have been reformations on these matters in the past, and many arguments about the best way of doing it. Even amongst Christians there have been arguments, and still are today, arguments about what is the best music to impart the depth and beauty of the scriptural texts. And that sometimes comes down to denomination and tradition, but it could also be do with musical style and so on. There's lots of different styles through history, even from Christian composers. Can we trace a connection between them? In some ways we can, in some ways we can't. However, your mention of Gregorian chant, I think, is absolutely seminal to the discussion, because Gregorian chant is not just the music of the church, the very first music that emerged from the church, but it's the music that shaped subsequent millennia in the church. The music of the first millennia, you could say, Gregorian chant, became the DNA in many ways of the music of the second millennia, especially in music for the church, especially sacred music. meaning that all those great composers from Leonin and Perotin, from the medieval times right through Dufay and Dunstable, Josquin des Prés, Palestrina, Lassus, Victoria, Bird, Gibbons, right through to Monteverdi and so on, they knew their chant, and the music that they wrote was shaped by the knowledge of chant. Sometimes they deliberately, and in many, many cases, took the chant and used it as the basis of new music that came about. So in a sense, in one way or another, Gregorian chant was shaping the music of the church, shaping the music of the culture, shaping the music that was to serve God in the liturgy. So in my mind, at least, Gregorian chant is vitally important. It's central to the consideration of music in our culture and indeed the music of the church. And there are many people outside the world of Catholicism who agree with me in that. They realise there's something really beautiful about the chant. I'm intrigued that even in our modern age that Gregorian chant, recordings of Gregorian chant have become very popular in the popular culture. People listen to it because it's serene and mysterious. It makes them feel at ease and so on. I can understand that there's an archetypal beauty about Gregorian chant, this endless melody that could go on and on forever. There's a perfection about chant, which in a sense shows the rest of us that there's something in it. Maybe there's something in it that we can take from. My great friend and mentor in many ways, the composer Peter Maxwell Davies, no great friend of the church, died about 10 years ago, had a copy of the Liber Usualis on his composing desk.
Did he?
And he looked at it every day he composed because he saw in the chant, in these manuscripts, something of the essence of what music was. And even he, from his position of antipathy towards the church, realised that we had something essential, a gift to history again. I'd like to explore this about the chant because not only did it influence the music of the second millennium, first millennium music, it's still with us. It's still there in the church. The church still has access to it, and composers are still using it. My music is influenced in many ways by the chant, but it even begins before the chant, because many scholars have pointed out that Gregorian chant, the origins of it, comes from the first few centuries of the church, had its roots in practice and in design in the chant of the Jewish synagogue and temple, and that for hundreds of years, millennia before Gregorian chant came about, before the advent of Christianity, the people of God were chanting their prayers, and they were using the structure of chant that have very, very close similarities with the beginnings of our Gregorian chant. There's something in that, there's a connectivity going from modernity right through these millennia, right through to the beginnings of chant and beyond into the Old Testament. And when you think that Jesus Christ himself was a singer, because all Jewish people were singers, they sang their prayers for hundreds of years before he was born and before he died. Jesus would be chanting. On the night he was betrayed, he would be chanting with his friends, and maybe there was something of the contours of those melodies that they sang, and it would be scraps, fragments of chant, fragments of the psalms that they would be singing before the meal, during the meal, at the end of the meal. Maybe there was something of the contours of the very songs that he and his disciples would be singing that ended up being the basis of Gregorian chant. So Gregorian chant has a historical and practical position and place in our culture, but maybe even could be detected by or traced back to the person of Jesus himself, and in the Jewish culture that shaped him. There's a message in that. It's perhaps to the composer of today, I look at that history and that strong lineage that can be traced back into the Old Testament and say, maybe there is something in this that is still alive and pertinent and relevant to even what I'm doing in the 21st century with so much distance and divide from the origins.
Well, yeah, so I'm going to give you a quote from a newspaper, a British newspaper. It was a headline in an article about modern classical music. You used the word arts music, I believe. But it said, modern classical music, it's not as bad as it sounds. And then it went on to explain how, even though we don't like it, we should. What that said to me was that we have the sort of music he was referring to is not easily accessible. You have to have it explained to you why you should. You almost have to have your common sense of beauty and what is good educated out of you in order to appreciate it. And that perhaps the music of the academy, of the conservatory, has become detached from this lineage that you're describing. And that doesn't mean we need to reject it all, but maybe the way to accommodate it is to reconnect all of this with the sacred again, and particularly with its Christian lineage in the West.
There's a lot to say about this.
Go on, say it. Yeah.
There's first of all, there's lots of music that sounds difficult to our ears. Music that we don't know very well. Music from other cultures can sound not just difficult but unnerving. So I'm slightly sceptical about because a style is unfamiliar, it's therefore to be rejected or to be avoided or has a problem. The sound of Jews chanting psalms in the early days of the church or before would have sounded very strange to our ears. The sound, I mean, it's changing now, but gradually the West, people in our cultures got to know music of other cultures, and we found it very difficult. Listening to Javanese gamelan music for the first time can be disorienting. Listening to Indian ragas can be disorienting, but there's a great beauty in that music that we have to embrace and maybe even learn about. So that there's that argument, but there's the other aspects of the issue that concern modernism, and the quote you gave me is really a reflection on the difficulties about modern music, and there is something to be talked about there, because there was in modernism, and the various stages of modernism in music, a move away from tradition, and sometimes that was a deliberate move away.
Yes.
And it was because composers and their supporters developed a fascination with certain aspects of music, certain parameters of music that the wider musical public didn't share. For example, Arnold Schoenberg, in the first decade of the 20th century, formed a society for the private performance of new music. So even then there was a realization that only a small group of aficionados would get this music, would understand that music. And they probably took a pride in that. They probably saw it as a sign of intellectual superiority, that there was a group of composers and their friends could understand music where the general public could not. To others, though, that has become a problem. And through the 20th century, it's become more and more of a problem. And part of the problem lies in the desire in modernism, as in the desire in Marxism, to have a breach with the past.
Yes.
That is the problem. To deliberately put up a barrier to tradition is a form of destruction. And at the heart of the modernist project, you could say, just as at the heart of the Marxist project, there is a desire to destroy the past.
Yes.
That is the problem. And that's where the breach has come about, and but it can be remedied. And modernism, the various modernisms that I've described, were in the scheme of things quite short-lived. They've had their day. I mean, I lived through that, and I was fascinated by these avant-garde composers. That's what I wanted to listen to and study. Did I like it? Some of it. I liked some of it more than others, but it was hard work. But then I realised that a lot of it was about breach and rejection of tradition, and I realised I'm not like that. I don't want to be involved in the breach with tradition. It is much more an exciting and inventive and expressive thing to feel part of a tradition. And there has been an attitude towards tradition from the modernists and the Marxists which has disparaged it. As I say, in modern artistic culture and in the modernistic music that I'm talking about, there were attempts to put up a dam in the river, as it were. Now, I prefer to see tradition as a flowing river, which has a deep past,
Yes.
which is to be valued, a present, and if I stand at the bank of the river, I'm on the precipice of the present. I'm looking at the present river, and that river flows into the future, and you can see the future going from its past through the present to the future. That is a healthy image of tradition. To want to dam that up is to desiccate it and to destroy the flow, and that is an act of violence, it's an act of destruction. And that's why I've come to the conclusion, and many others too, that modernism was a destructive force in philosophy and in politics and in the arts, and that we should reassess the role of tradition in the light of this. And we now have the confidence to do that. Tradition is a life-giving force. It is a progressive force because it's moving forward from the past. There is nothing reactionary about being a traditionalist in that sense. And I'm speaking as a composer, but I'm also speaking as a Christian. There is nothing reactionary in valuing the traditions of the Judeo-Christian culture. We have inherited a great gift from the past, and we as Christians are agents of handing that gift on to others who don't share their faith at the moment and may indeed do so in the future.
Yes, so again, that's terrific. So drawing the analogy with art and beauty, in beauty and visual art, what I hear you saying is that tradition is really the guide for us as to what is beautiful and what is good. We're trusting in the common sense of the past leading into the present. But then there's a distinction that it doesn't mean historicism. It doesn't mean we simply replicate the past. It always has to be created afresh for each generation, because we are of a particular time and place. We're on that bank in the present, in a particular place. We have a particular set of experiences which are different from every position on the bank in the past, every position in the future. And that suggests to me that this is the place of the composer today, is we have to be aware of where we've come from, where we're going, and this balance that you described of being educated in beauty. So there are things which initially seem very difficult, but our taste can be developed. We have to bear that in mind. But at the same time, there are some things which we have to understand are not good and are not beautiful, and we have to learn to recognize that. How do we work our way through this? It's only tradition, it seems to me, that can help us in all these areas. So what I'm thinking of here, the other thing that occurred to me as you spoke, is that is a motto that I have, which is humble prayer feeds high culture. You talk about ordinary people going back to the time of Christ and before, praying the Psalms. That can be true today. We can do that in our homes, but if we develop that habit, that can be the feeding ground, the nourishment for the high culture of today as well. That it emanates from a personal engagement. Now, I'm just wondering, well, first of all, what your reaction to that is in the context of music, and a high culture and an accessible culture. So high culture can be popular culture as well. And then how, after that, that impacts how we might form composers. We're here this week at the Princeton Theological Seminary, this wonderful event with the Catholic Sacred Music Project and the Scala Foundation, trying to do that. You're here leading us, in a sense, in this formation. So how do we pull that together? How do you, when you're confronted with these very young, aspiring composers, how do you draw that together?
Well, it's interesting. This has cropped up in some of the discussions we've had this week about our relationship with the past as composers, and how much do we take on board from the past and make the past present in what we do. And it can be quite a complicated discussion, because sometimes taking on board the past does mean historicism, and that can be a mistake. If one simply imitates the polyphony of Palestrina, it sounds like a copy of a copy of a copy, and inauthentic. And it is partly because we're at centuries removed from it. But the question is how do we make polyphony, for example, in the 21st century? Is it something we should be doing, or not? Or can it be adapted to a modern language? All these things have cropped up. The conversations we've had have been delightful, amazing, and inconclusive. But I mean, the way I was saying today that I valued my very traditional training, and that involved the study of counterpoint. Which is the study of polyphony of these composers like Palestrina, the study of fugue, the study of the harmony of the past. As a composer, not to imitate those things, but perhaps to engage with the archetypes that they offer us. So when I studied species counterpoint, which is the way of learning about the polyphony of Palestrina, we studied the style of Palestrina, how Palestrina put line against line, voice against voice, and made something complex out of something simple. When I was asked to write fugal expositions, I did imitate the style of Bach. So my imitations weren't good, but I learned something about how Bach dealt with the great quest, that is to put line against line, melody against melody, to make something complex. Why are these composers wanting to make something complex out of something simple? I think it's a great aspiration on the part of the composer to build these superstructures out of something simple, so taking a DNA of a little cell and build these incredible structures. Look at Thomas Tallis's 40-part motet Speminalium, a work of incredible genius and architecture, very, very complex. I studied that. I wanted to make music like that, but I knew if I wrote it the way Tallis wrote it, it would just sound inauthentic. However, I learned a concept from those studies. I learned that one could make complex music structures using various different kind of elements. It may not be, for me, line against line or melody, although it can be, but it could be rhythm against rhythm, which is a very modern concept, rhythms. Yes. It could be tonality against tonality, taking one tonality and making it work and hearing it audibly against another tonality, which is something that many composers are fascinated by, from Stravinsky through the great film composers and interage, but it's got to be audible. You've got to feel the tension of one harmony against another. These are archetypes that I've learned from my great teachers of the past, and now it's beginning to work for me using a language which I think is of our time. So I don't want to write pastiche, which is parodying the past, but I've learned so much from these composers that I can make it work according to my own agenda.
Right. So you talked about rhythm against rhythm and tone against tone, and again, going back to my analogy with art, if I was to be cynical, I would look at expressionistic art. But a lot of people today, if they paint, they use expressionistic styles or even go into abstraction. And I would say, rather cynically, that 95%, even more than 95% of that, is really the people who can't paint and they're just hiding behind the style. Mm-hmm. And again, rather cynically, I want to say that dissonance is for people who can't compose. They just hide behind random notes and no harmony. And frankly, I could do it. I could just scattergun compose. Mm-hmm. I suspect that that isn't the case, because I know also the other side of it is that there's good in everything. And somehow, sometimes these expressions of art, which are, I agree with you that the Marxist influence is driving a break with tradition, and they wanted to undermine Christianity. But sometimes, inadvertently, they throw up something which Christians can use for the glory of God. Mm-hmm. When I listen to your music, I hear little movements. I'm not an expert into what I call sort of the chord structure is not as Palestrina would have used it. It sounds modern, mm-hmm. but you seem to have incorporated it into a way that it all works together in an integrated form. Mm-hmm. Can you talk to that a little bit about how you adapt what you're seeing from the last 100 years and then bring it into line with tradition? Or do you do that consciously, or is it unconscious?
It's unconscious.
Okay,
yeah.
That's interesting.
It's very difficult for a composer to self-analyse and sometimes to make an account of what one does, even although we are quite analytical.
Yes.
We've spent our lives analysing other music. But when it gets so close as to be one's own utterances, it becomes very difficult to make an account of what one's, not so much what one is doing, but where it's come from and how it fits into one's own evolution. I feel as if I've just written the same music over the last 40, 50 years, but it's quite clear that my style and language has changed.
Yes.
It's evolved. I've never been aware of that. It's never been a conscious decision, but it has changed.
It's interesting, yes.
It's a bit like, the analogy here I'd like to use is like finding old letters that one wrote when I was young, and seeing in the words of those letters, might be decades ago, that yes, it's quite clearly the same person, but the realisation, rather wistful realisation perhaps, that one has changed. One thinks differently from the boy that wrote, or the young man that wrote those words. And it's like that in music too. I listen to music I wrote in my 20s and 30s, and it's me. Mm. I'm delighted with it, but it's not what I would do now. And I don't know what made that happen, because I just feel as if I'm doing the same thing. So there are other mysterious intrusions happening in the creative person's life that one is not aware of. It could be other people or events, or as a Catholic composer, one has to believe in the intervention of divine influences too,
Grace.
Of course.
Yes, absolutely.
So all these things add up and it affect the evolution of an individual. The other thing, your earlier point about expressionism in art and the technical inabilities of many, the inability to draw, which has been masked by this self-expression ethic. It's more difficult to get away with that in music, because in music one has to be an artisan as much as an artist. One has to learn the basics of how music works. And that doesn't mean that you just throw notes at a page. There has always been dissonance. It's just been handled in different ways throughout history. There are dissonances in Palestrina and Bach and Mozart. There's a dissonance quartet by Mozart, but it's the way it all resolves that is common to their time. But we have to learn we had to learn profoundly practical skills, as I think visual artists have to as well. It's just that they've been diverted by
Yes.
ideological interference, I think, in the art schools.
Yeah.
That hasn't happened yet with music. It may happen, and we're always wary. The ideologues are at the gate
Wow.
in every art form.
Yeah.
And they would love to get in there, and their way in to destroying our art form is through ideology associated with extra musical matters, to do with culture and politics. We must resist that and stick to being practical composers.
Yes, I agree with you that that's what's going on, and it had struck me that in art the process of discarding rigour and discipline in the training is more complete, and I'm pleased to hear that it isn't in music. I suspected that was the case. So certainly then, even today, just about, if you study music, you have to learn the theory, you have to be able to have the skill of the composer that you talked about, harmony and counterpoint and fugue, all these various forms. That has to be studied. I'm curious about the creative process itself. Do you just wait for something to come? Or is there a discipline that you can apply when you compose? What do you do when you sit down? How does that work?
Every day is different. I don't have a very clear answer for that. Yes, ideas just come sometimes.
Yeah.
But sometimes they sort of fester away for years before you finally are able to sort of handle it in a way that you want. Sometimes they come very, very abruptly and suddenly. Inspiration can be sudden, or there can be a slow growth. It's frustrating being a composer because you've no idea how a piece is going to emerge in that sense. One has to wait to be ready. And you can certainly feel things building up. I'm aware of that. Subliminal thoughts, sleeping thoughts. I mean, I think a lot of composers work as they sleep, and when they're certainly doing other things. And I get a lot of young composers speaking to me about their anxieties, about what is in essence the equivalent of a writer's block. They talk about have my ideas run out of steam? Have they dried up? And I say to them, that's not what happens. When you're not thinking about music, you're composing. Subliminal thought processes are at work. I do dream music, not very often, but I'm much more aware of solutions being provided by being asleep. You know, I go to sleep at night worrying over something, and by the morning it's sorted itself out. So something has happened in those sleeping hours. So the kind of subliminal, subconscious aspect of composition is important, and we have no control over that. It's just our human nature, human being that allows that to happen. Having said all that, there's a way of working. I mean, once something has crystallised into some kind of shape, you can then start working it hard. You can experiment with it. You can sketch it in one way. You can play it. You know, I personally prefer to think things through. To hear things here rather than use technology, and even primitive technology like a piano, because the piano, and even worse, computer sounds, can give a wrong impression of what you want to create. If you're writing a choral piece, the last thing that you want to hear is a piano or some kind of synthesizer getting in the way. So there's a kind of muscle. It's not really a muscle, but it's a kind of hypothetical, mystical, spiritual muscle in the brain or in the soul that has to be trained to hear music in the absence of music, in the vacuum of silence. That has to be engaged with, and perhaps therefore deep encounters with the silence, deep planned encounters with silence, has become more and more important to me. A prayer life, a structured prayer life, which I would always discount when I was younger, but now it's absolutely essential.
That's fascinating. I have an idea that I'm very interested in creativity and the creative process, and I always think that this has application across all human activity, and that really an exposure to beauty, a formation in beauty, is really forming us, impressing upon our souls, so to speak, the cosmic order, which is the pattern of the Creator. And when we see a solution or have an idea that is good, what we're doing is we have an array of data in some way, whether it's musical or scientific or artistic, and we just see the point which completes that pattern. And now you can't budget for that. You can't say, I'm going to see it. But the deeper exposure we have to the divine and the cosmic order, and also the works of beauty across the culture within the tradition of the past, the more likely we're going to see those things. And of course, we're not all meant to be composers or artists. Some will be called to be creative in all sorts of different ways. But what it suggests to me is that as part of everybody's education, we need to be exposed not just to the beauty of nature, but the beauty of a culture, and a traditional culture which embodies that divine order. And that is how you as a composer transmit that order to people who are receptive to music. Those who are particularly receptive to music will respond to, in the same way that those who are receptive to art may, one hopes, respond to my work. I don't know. But this is is an additional point of what we do. We're conveying God in so many different ways. And enhancing the creativity of all people, I think, in participating in God's redemptive work.
I think you're right. I mean, I followed a life as a composer because I was exposed to beauty at a very early stage, and it was the beauty of music. But there were other forms of beauty as well. You know, encountering music in all its glory at a very early age, hearing some of the great composers was mind-blowing for me. And it maybe wasn't the case for, I know it wasn't the case for everybody, but for me it just opened me up to the desire to do something similar in my life. I didn't know what that would mean at that stage, but I knew that I wanted more of that. I was completely floored by it. Changed even as a young boy by hearing, I don't know, Mozart's clarinet concerto for the first time, or Haydn's trumpet concerto. I was a trumpeter, an aspirant trumpeter. I just couldn't believe the beauty of and it was the beauty. I come from a working class background in Scotland. Working class men like me and my dad and my grandfather didn't use the word beauty. We didn't know. We knew what it meant, but it would never come from our lips because it was too feminine or too beyond our experience. We were hard men, and who worked down the mine or worked with their hands, in my dad's case, and amongst ourselves we talked about football and not about beauty. So I found it difficult to even use that word and eventually start talking about it in the community that I'm from. But then I realised that there were hundreds, maybe thousands of people in exactly the same boat who were inspired by beauty but kept it quiet. And then you realise that there's beauty in many, many other things. I mean, one of the earliest musical memories I ever had, and it was before I even started playing music, was encountering music at Mass when I was a little boy, about 5. My mother and father used to take me to Edinburgh on a family holidays to meet relatives, and we'd always go to the Catholic cathedral there, and I was just aware of this sound in the distance because I was just little, and straining to see what it was, and I could see robed figures and clouds of incense and lots of ritualistic movements that looked distant and strange. But I realised that the music that I was heard was facilitating something else, something profound, and there was a connection, and again an umbilical connection between the music and the act of worship, the act of faith. That even I didn't know what I was seeing, but it left an indelible impression, and a realisation in my mind that the world of music was connected with the world of faith or the world of the spirit. That the beauty that you encounter in music has a connection with other forms of beauty, maybe a primal beauty, a fundamental beauty, and that there are complex ways of describing how that builds. But any time I encounter beauty in other forms, whether it be a person or an event, an act of generosity or kindness, a building, a painting or anything, I'm struck by it, and I always have this feeling, I want to do that in music. I want to replicate that beauty in my own way. And it's there's no single way of doing it. I mean, a person's face or a person's words is different from St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, but the same impact of meeting these things, sometimes dramatic, sometimes very gentle and sensitive and understated, still has this eventually convulsive effect that make you want to react to it in a music, in my case, in a musical way.
I just want to finish there. I could go on, so many of the things you're saying. But let's think about the future. I have a sense that, I think especially since COVID, actually, I don't know, it's almost like there's the Black Death, there's pre and post. There's this sort of pre-COVID and post-COVID. I wonder if history will view it like that. But that there is a new hope, actually. I have a sense, just anecdotally, that more and more people are searching beauty, seeking faith, and they're serious about it. And they've understood that what you described about modernism and its various sort of iterations up to the present day is a break from tradition, and there's something, it involves a desolation, and they want to escape that. First of all, do you share that hope? And I just wonder what you see going on around you at the moment. You have your festival in Scotland. How do you see the future in the next few years? Do you share my optimism, and where do you see it going?
Yes, I do share your optimism. Sometimes it does take a desolation to make everything begin again.
Yes.
And COVID might be one of those desolations. The desolation I refer to in this is the experience of communism, which came to an end of sorts in 1989, 1990. And I go to Estonia a lot. It's a beautiful musical country there. I love performing there. And I was in Arvo Pärt's company a few weeks ago. He was this great composer.
Yeah.
And well, the first thing was when he's very frail now, and he doesn't hear very much, so he's reluctant to meet people. But I was able to meet him, and he was delighted to meet me, and I went with my wife. And if you go on a Wednesday morning, and when I mean go, you go to the Arvo Pärt Centre. There's this incredible centre now, built by the Estonian government, which is full of archives and libraries, concert halls. But he insisted that when this was built, that an Orthodox chapel be placed in the grounds, and he prays there. And if you go on a Wednesday morning, you don't just go to speak to Arvo Pärt, you go to pray with Arvo Pärt in this chapel. It's a tiny little space, very cramped, but you're right next to him. You can hear him breathe, and it's full of all the people that work in the Arvo Pärt Centre, these bright young things who have had no Christian upbringing because of communism. Their parents were even divorced from the church, forced away from religion. But there they are, deep in prayer, ritual prayer, chanting prayer with Arvo Pärt. musical chant, Orthodox chant, a lot of young women as well, praying in front of icons. And that is a sign that desolation can be confronted, that as you step up to the abyss can be redeemed.
Mm.
You can see it in the experience of the Estonian people. Another visit, performance I gave in Estonia last year was of a little chamber opera of mine called Clemency. It's basically the Abraham and Sarah story, visited by these three presences from the Old Testament, and of course there's they're going to destroy the cities after this encounter, but they bring news of a child for Sarah, as you know, and then there's this dialogue between Abraham and God about compassion and a plea for clemency. Very complicated, strange but beautiful story. The Estonians in the audience had never encountered this story, and they came and spoke to me. It was like seeing a brand new film or something for them, because communism had knocked religion out of them. They had no encounter with the gospel, with the Bible. They didn't know the Bible, so they don't know these ancient stories, and it was as if they were seeing and hearing it for the first time, and that was delivered through a modern composer and setting the text of a modern poet. So from that, the desolation of state atheism imposed on millions of people, there are again embers emerging from the abyss that may grow, and in fact we do see it growing in various places, and there are many, many different ways of wafting those embers into bigger flames, but I'm sure artists, composers and everyone else can be part of that.
Yes. Well, that's a wonderful optimistic note to finish on, and I think we'll stop there. James MacMillan, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.